Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am Foong Ping. I am the Foster Foundation Curator of Chinese Art at the Seattle Art Museum. And I want to share some research that my colleague Geneva Griswold and I have been conducting. And the title of our talk today is The Enigma of an Exalted Monk. Geneva?
I'm Geneva Griswold. I'm the Associate Conservator at the Seattle Art Museum, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so we first presented this talk in the January of 2019 as part of the Conversation with Curators series at the Seattle Art Museum. And we, at the time, weren't able to record it, so we thought we would share our talk with you today through our most recent technology that we've learned about, known as Zoom. Hi, Geneva. So our sculptor, he's a wooden sculpture, and he depicts a monk with one leg up. You can see his body is twisting in the opposite direction that his leg is pointed towards, and he's grasping here. You'll see his outer robe. He does it very powerfully with one hand, and his other hand over here is clenched. And as our founding director, Dr. Richard Fuller, put it, his head is lifted, his eyes shining below heavy eyebrows, teeth biting the lower lip. You can almost hear his breath hissing out. You see his clenched teeth in this very dramatic moment captured and sculpted in wood. It is beloved by all who have been to the Seattle Art Museum since its arrival in 1936. But what this wood sculpture depicts exactly remains a mystery. And the reason it remains a mystery is because the piece is quite unique. There are few other comparable sculptures in other museums. So, as some of you know, our Seattle Asian Art Museum was under a renovation project. We only just recently reopened in February. But when we closed down for the renovation, this made it possible for me to examine the piece very closely, and because it was removed from view and put into storage. And you'll see here, I'm showing you my not very professional snapshot from using my iPhone camera. It is our monk very securely strapped down during the move. So let me give you a sense of how I look at an object, sort of the kinds of questions that I keep in mind in a close encounter with a work of art. Now, in storage, I got close and personal for a few hours with this piece, and I was able to make two new observations. And these are initial observations that invite further research in the future. I looked at all of the details, the seams, the breaks, the surface condition. I thought about what technical questions are important to ask about this work of art, the kinds of questions that somebody like my colleague here might be able to help me with. For example, carving. So questions like, how many blocks of wood were used? Was it made out of a single tree or multiple trees? Another question would be a sense of size, that is, what are comparably sized works, because this is actually a very large piece. Another question that is of a more technical nature is the type of wood. So is it a willow or paulownia, or is it a linden? And there are significances with the type of wood and the period, and most importantly, geography, where these trees come from. Finally, a technical question is, so how many layers of gesso or paint is there? So the layers of lacquer or gold or paint. I also looked at how the hands and the feet are depicted. So whether these shoes are open-toed or closed-toed, whether they have strappy sandals or were they made out of straw or cloth that is depicted as made out of straw or cloth. And these are the types that one might expect somebody like our monk to wear. And these are, of course, the types that are shown in paintings and stone carvings. It's a way to try and find comparative works in other media, paintings and stone carvings. So our records indicated that there were actually, as you can see in this old photograph, 2 blocks in the back. So I went looking for these. These were once removed to see if there was anything inside. That is, the sculpture is hollow inside. The cavity is empty. But the records didn't show that there was actually an inscription. It appears that I'm actually the first person to see this character, oops, right here. Now, I saw something else that I thought that was rather interesting. I was examining the eyes very closely to see if they might have once had a stone inlay, which is something that's quite commonly seen in statues, that the eyes are not the same wood, but are stone or some other kind of glittering material. And when I observed, what I observed was that this head has actually a 3rd rectangular block right here. And it's not very visible because, as you can see, it has been painted over and then sealed. Now, scholars have argued for decades about the identity of this monk, who he is, who he represents. So here is a quick reconstruction of what we already know. That is what allowed Dr. Fuller to make certain, to tell us what we know about him. So Dr. Fuller described the monk as exalted. And this was written in the card catalog, original card catalog, that marked the entry of this work of art into the museum's collection. And in parentheses in the card catalog, next to this idea that he was an exalted monk, was the phrase, "at the moment of enlightenment." Now, this notion that the sculpture depicts a monk on the cusp of attaining the most important spiritual transition has really held our imagination for many decades, unchanged. It really does spark the imagination. And our former curators also associated the monk with enlightenment. These are my predecessors, such as Henry Trubner, who described him specifically as a kind of Chan Buddhist monk. Chinese scholars who later came to survey our collection named him as a particular type of a monk. That is, this was around 1990. They called him a Luohan. Now, I have a new proposition. That this proposition relates to recent scholarship, and it also relates to the last decade of Chinese publications on temple carvings. That is, we now know quite a lot more about Luohan worship and temple context of such sculptures. Yet, even now, there are still many mysteries remaining. A monk is definitely a Luohan, which is the Chinese transliteration for an Indian word in Sanskrit. That is, Luohan is the equivalent in Sanskrit of arhat. What is a Luohan or an arhat? Well, the scriptures talk about various groupings. There are groups of 4 or 16 or 18 or even 500 Luohans, and they are Buddha's virtuous disciples who have attained enlightenment, but they are the figures who also vowed to stay and remain in this world, prolonging their lives here in order to protect the Dharma, that is Buddhist law, in order to ensure the correct transmission of Dharma. Now, Luohans became approachable facilitators to all who aspired to reach enlightenment. That is, they were more approachable than the Buddha. Previous scholars proposed this wood sculpture as a good comparison to others, to ours rather, and I agree. Although I also want to point out that he is a little bit missing the tension and the drama of our work. That is to say, he appears much more relaxed to me than our monk. Now, this piece depicts one of the 16 Luohans. He is in the Rijksmuseum collection in the Netherlands, and the Rijksmuseum curators name him as one of the 16, that is Ajita, number 15 of 16. And like our monk, you can see he has also one leg up, just like ours. His head is tilted upwards, and you see his eyes, they are made out of inlaid glass. So he does actually make a relatively good comparison, I think. The physiognomy, I think, is very notable. So there are really two major artistic paradigms for Luohan images in China. Firstly, the grotesque form, grotesque type. Monks who are just, well, downright ugly, yet they are very charismatic and even majestic. And in Chinese Buddhist art, artists often depict Luohans as foreigners, that is, as Indians or Central Asians. They're these stereotypically grotesque. They're often depicted with darker skin, with these very prominent noses and large crania, these bushy eyebrows. They have long, really long earlobes. In paintings, and you can't do this in sculpture, obviously, in paintings, they often depicted to be horribly hairy. In the second paradigm, Luohans have a more human-like beauty, at least human, beautiful, according to Han Dynasty, Han Chinese norms, that is Chinese norms. And they have these sort of more human-like Luohans have an air of quietude. They're calm and quiet. So here are the two paradigms, and they become quite consistent from the Song Dynasty onwards in both painting and sculpture, 12th, 13th century onwards. So Luohans are fierce. Their supernatural powers show physical strength or martial attitude, like in our monk, but some of them are portrayed as contemplative, or Buddhist monks in holding deep concentration. So this kind of inward-looking face, their countenance, reflects the high level of their spiritual attainment. Now, paintings of them often have various attributes or some kind of distinctive gesture. So they most commonly, they hold rosaries and sutra books. There is one Luohan who is accompanied by a tiger as his animal familiar, and another one has a dragon as his pet. Now, both our monk and this piece on the left, both have this prominent bump on the head that indicate their supernatural status. This is known as the urna, which is an attribute of a Luohan and of the Buddha. However, the wood sculpture on the left, and you just saw a detail of his face, he shows an attitude that is not an attribute like the urna is an attribute. So you will see here, this very delicate hands. They hold a mudra or a significant gesture, but the leaning posture that he's leaning on this arm, that is more artistic license than it is religious iconography. So I think what he's doing is that he's staring at somebody else. He has this frown on his face. So he's probably in an intense debate with another Luohan who was once next to him. Both of the monks are Chinese. That is, they both wear Chinese monastic robes. They do not depict foreigners, and they are likely not of the grotesque type. Although, to be fair, our monks' facial features, especially these heavy lidded eyes, they kind of veer towards the direction of being grotesque. Now, both of these sculptures have a high degree of realism as individual portraits, and it's certainly it's certainly plausible to associate this type of realism to the ritual needs of certain Chan or Zen Buddhist sects, which require master-pupil interaction. But such associations tell us more about how Chinese sculpture was appreciated in the West as sculpture, at least since the 1920s and 1930s, when both of these pieces were collected. But that particular way of thinking doesn't get us too much further. Recent scholarship has established very clearly in China that Luohans were believed to have the power to offer relief in difficult times. That is, the related rituals really motivated making these types of images. Now, in popular Chinese belief, Luohans were called thaumaturgists. That's spelled Thaumaturgists, miracle workers. And even images of them held magical power. So they were worshipped for their magical powers in ritual ceremonies from at least the 8th century onwards. The cult of Luhan evolved in China as it was joined with certain native faiths like Taoism, and also local beliefs and legends, which literally transform these arhats of the Indian scriptures. So one important idea that evolved from at least the 11th century onwards, that is, local officials often pray to Luohan images, and sometimes successfully, and they prayed towards these images for rain. Now, while in Seattle, we generally don't need to pray for extra rain, nevertheless, this was an idea that I pursued in my research about our monk. That is, I felt that it was important to understand our monk as an object of religious efficacy. And particularly, I believe that our monk is a dragon tamer. The dragon tamer holds membership as one of 18 Luohans. This is a very famous set of paintings in the Taipei National Palace Museum, showing each Luohan with individual features and attributes. And the dragon tamer is the one looking at the dragon. Here he is, looking at the dragon. And his counterpart has a tiger right here. So he's sort of petting his familiar baby lion, sort of charmingly here, chomping on his sleeve like a kitten. I love this painting. The dragon tamer's attributes in this painting are a bowl here and a pearl right here. And these two things help him express his power over dragons. And these two paintings both show the grotesque and the contemplative artistic Luohan paradigms. You can see here is the human-like and contemplative type and the grotesque type. Now, each Luohan has its own complex hagiography, sort of which, and these stories describe their features, their special powers. Then these stories and these pictorial imaginings associated with them get more and more complicated over time. They get more and more fantastic. This image that I'm showing you here shows 16 Luohans presided over by here, the Bodhisattva Guan Yin. And you might note that the dragon tamer in this image is at the center of it all. Intense stare, he has bushy eyebrows versus his Chinese colleague below. He has a very dramatic twist in his body. His arm is going this way, his body is going the opposite way. And he's doing this in order to manifest his power, which is to control the dragon that's inside the water nearby. And everybody is looking onwards admiringly. So obviously paintings, they offer a very direct invitation into this wonderful and fantastic world of Luohans. So this fun painting shows why Luohan imagery was so popular. It shows their magical powers in the most charming way possible. Now, each Luohan is riding his own vehicle to visit with this person on this side, which is the Dragon King. Those here at the bank here, two of them riding the animal familiars. One is the tiger and the lion. They obviously have to wait at the bank because neither of those animals can swim. But above here, the dragon tamer rides his dragon flying in the air. Here he is holding up his bow. In this 14th century painting, the dragon tamer is shown as a dark-skinned Indian monk. Here his chest is bare, his left fist is clenched, his mouth is half opening. It's as if, here you can see his teeth even, he's speaking a dharani or a spell to compel the dragon to enter into this thing here, which is his black bowl. And here's the dragon's head in order to capture this dragon. So this magical act has caused the wind to blow really hard. So here his robes are flying. His audience is awed. Even the general has these googly eyes over here. His little child is frightened. So while our monk sculpture does not have a bowl, which if he had a bowl, that would be really the smoking gun, I think this is a very good comparison, and it's a good reason to re-identify a monk as the dragon tamer Luohan. Now, the dragon tamer Luohan has various formal names. In Sanskrit, it's Nandimitra, or in Chinese, Qingyou Zunze. It's rather tantalizing that the character that I saw in our sculpture is the same as the second character in the dragon tamer's name. This is Qingyou Zunze. This character Yo is the one that appears on his back. But let me emphasize that even that is still not enough to prove his identity. Naja, the fiendish child god of Indian mythology and tantric Buddhism, who in one legend is the protector of the Yuan dynasty capital of Beijing. He is actually, in fact, a very famous dragon queller. So Naja's cult was adopted by the Taoist clergy and in popular religion. It was integrated into Chinese culture. He is a Chinese household name today, but not many know about the roles that Naja played in earlier Chinese history. He's so popular that actually he starred in 2 summers ago in a wonderful animated blockbuster in China. So very well-known name in China today. But that's not actually the image that I want to point out. One early version of the story of Naja tells how he, at a very tender age of 5 days old, overcame the ocean's dragon lords and killed their king. This was by the Ming Dynasty. And he also features in much later novels, for example, the famous Journey to the West, which elaborated on Naja's battle with water monsters. And after killing those monsters, he made himself a belt from their sinews from their body. And because of this magic belt, Naja became the tutelary divinity of the sash and girdle manufacturing guilds in China. Our monk is certainly no infant god, so I would not name him Naja necessarily, but it would appear that his identity is a combination of at least 2 sources, both of which relate to controlling dragons and the Dragon King, who in turn, of course, control the oceans and whether we have drought or rain.
Okay. The conservator's role is to support curatorial research through technical study of the materials and how they are put together. So let's get into it. The sculpture's substrate, or its body, is composed of 5 blocks of carved wood. The joints between them are noted here by yellow lines. The lower right detail shows the carved tool marks of a gouge, like this one, which has a 2 millimeter wide scoop used to hollow out the interior. One reason for figures like these to be hollow is that the tree's inner heartwood dries slower than the exterior sapwood, causing splitting and warping if the heartwood is not removed. The decorative surface layers are composed of an overall white ground, followed by black, red, white, and green pigments, finished with gilding along the garment's bottom hem and collar, which has by now lost a bit of its luster. Of the 3 panels located on the sculpture's reverse, only the head panel has never been opened. The possibility of a devotional object or offering being inside the head prompted this investigation, which so far includes an imaging series in the reflected infrared, ultraviolet, and X-ray wavelengths. Unlike removing a sample, imaging is non-invasive and non-destructive, meaning that we can extract information from the artwork without touching or altering it in any way. But we will return to the possibilities for sampling in a little bit. Infrared reflectance photography, or IRR, is commonly used to visualize carbon-based underdrawings and faded inscriptions. The remains of text on the back panel here appear black, indicating that they are absorbing energy, but unfortunately no further characters could be discerned. This is because the text was likely written on top of the paint layers and so was lost along with the paint. Viewing the surface under ultraviolet illumination activates materials such as organic binders in the paint, coatings, areas of restoration, and some mineral pigments. Here we see the bright white fluorescence of rabbit skin glue that we know was previously used to consolidate paint on the chin and the base of the sculpture. A braided bare wood at the toe fluoresces bright orange. Dark yellow fluorescence at the figure's neck and hand is where the white ground is exposed. Red, pink, rather faint fluorescence at the sash and at the hips may indicate that the mercury-based red pigment called vermilion is present. And then a pale orange fluorescence appears to correspond to areas of lead-based white paint. The green and black pigments don't appear here because they absorb UV radiation and so appear dark. Now I'm jumping ahead here because an ultraviolet image visually locates materials, but does not identify a material or its elemental makeup. To do that, we use X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, or XRF, whereby an X-ray beam emitted from this unit excites material at the sculpture's surface to produce a spectra like you see here, with peaks for each element present. And in this case, you're seeing iron. And while a qualitative method, by taking multiple readings at each spot, we can extrapolate the primary mineral colorant for each paint, which is highlighted here in yellow. So the skin contains lead, or white, with a little calcium and iron. You'll notice that the wood also contains calcium and iron, so we use that spectrum as a baseline and as a means of subtraction. The green is a copper-based pigment. The presence of gilding applied over red paint was confirmed. The red contains mercury, which is characteristic of the pigment cinnabar, also called vermilion. The white ground and the white pigment are both lead-based. And finally, the black contains iron with traces of calcium, potassium, and copper. And note here that the presence of lead and mercury makes handling of this sculpture hazardous. So gloves must be worn and then properly disposed of. X-radiography was used to visualize the internal structure. Long metal pins join the 5 wood sections. Here you see the drapery attached by pins inserted from opposing directions. And note that X-rays are higher energy than ultraviolet or infrared, so they pass all the way through the object to be registered in film on the other side, resulting in a compressed image. The head of the pin that joins the figure's proper left foot to the leg is visible in the image at the left, causing the paint to split inside that yellow circle. And I suspect it may be protruding due to corrosion, because you can see metal particles migrating into the wood in the X-radiograph on the right. And note that in the bottom of that X-ray, the giant pins on the bottom are actually from the modern mount that it's currently sitting on. So remember the panel in the back of the head that had not been opened. X-radiographs show that a cluster of material slightly denser than wood is located inside. It's this cluster here. We can also see that the interior hollow extends down into the neck, which should make you suspicious of how that dense material is defying gravity. And note again that the reason you see 2 ears here is because we're shooting all the way through the object and we're capturing everything in a compressed image. To achieve higher resolution, the next step was a CT scan, for which we packed and transported the sculpture to an off-site facility, specializing in industrial computer tomography scanning, primarily for the aviation industry. The technician seen here is ensuring that the sculpture can safely rotate a full 360 degrees while being captured by the X-ray beam. For safety, a camera inside the unit allowed us to view the figure's movement at all times. So that's what you see in your upper left. Here is the video scan of the head in profile. First, we see the shoulder and now the ear emerging. You can see the vertical lines of the wood grain and the dark hollow cavity that's extending up from the bottom of the image. And we see that now extending all the way through the neck of the figure. And then finally, these bright white tubular forms, dense forms at the very top of that cavity.
That is such an interesting video, Geneva.
It's phenomenal. So now we're passing through to the other side of its head. We're passing out of the cavity and we're going back through what would be the figure's proper right side. Pretty mesmerizing. And there's the right ear before we finally leave the image. Okay, so this dynamic model on the right allows us to rotate and isolate different views. So on the left, we're looking up toward the crown of the head, on the inside of the head. And at this point, it became clear that these lumpy, irregular clusters are not a human-made product. But instead, as our astute summer intern recognized, it resembles the structure of a mud wasp nest, perhaps the vestige of the sculpture's prior lifetime in an outdoor temple setting. And you can even see the wasp bodies and darker particulate inside these tubular forms. So while we've reached closure in one regard, next steps will include inserting a video probe to further visualize the tool marks on the interior carved surface, possibly sampling the pigments for microscopy, and the wood components for species identification and for dating. Published studies, which are summarized in this chart, evidence that a range of different wood types were used for sculpture at this time, as Ping mentioned. So it would be very interesting to see where our monk falls within the spectrum when we are able to proceed. Thank you.
Well, we had hoped to find something inside the head, but we weren't planning to find a wasp nest. You win some, you lose some. Sometimes you don't get what you hope to find, but in other ways, it's just as interesting to consider why we had this hope in the first place. The practice of consecrating Buddhist sculptures by inserting objects into the cavities is a common practice throughout East Asia. You also find this in Japan and Korea. So it's almost certain that this object that I'm showing you here, one of the earliest Chinese Buddhist votive images in our collection, was once consecrated with some kind of body relic, maybe a tiny piece of ash. And I know from other works, this was probably located inside of his Ushnisha bump, right inside here somewhere. Now, I don't think it would make a difference for my thinking, even if we actually took an MRI to find out that is an MRI of this gilt bronze object. So for this reason, I haven't asked Geneva to do it for me. The objects found inside of the cavities of sculptures can be quite amazing. This 11th century sculpture, you can see on the left, this is in the Lingyan temple. It was discovered with a set of mock organs, false organs, intestines that were made from cloth. You see that on the right. The temple had arranged the textiles in the shape of an intestine. And the interiors of sculptures can be furnished with incredibly complicated groups of items. Just in 2018, experts from Nara National University in Japan discovered about 180 artifacts inside of this statue on the left using CT scan. An entire hoard filling the cavity of the sculpture from top to bottom. You can see this here, some of the images of what was inside. Inside the head alone, there were at least 30 items, and there were other objects that appear to be relics and scrolls. And in the torso section, around 150 more artifacts. This 14th century Buddha sculpture at a Buddhist temple in Korea contained a contemporary 14th century sutra. And on the right, you will see a 3D CT scan done by the Research Institute of Buddhist Cultural Heritage in 2017. Now, I had originally hoped that those wasp nests inside of our monk's head was something like this sutra. You can see how similar that is. Well, oh well. It's okay. One of the most famous Chinese examples of internally consecrated statues in the world is, in fact, already in our very own collection. This is our boy in adoration. That is, he adores the Guan Yin, usually, the Bodhisattva Guan Yin. In Seattle, he is fondly known as our golden boy. And it is a sculptural type known at least from the 13th century. But what made our golden boy famous was what they found inside. Some decades ago, around 1980, the museum excavated the insides and discovered faux innards. Apparently, quite a selection, as you can see from these black and white photographs documenting that event of excavation. The pictures actually show Millard Rogers emptying the contents of the sculpture himself. You see him here, he's smoking a pipe. At the time, Dr. Fuller was our director and Millard Rogers served as associate director. And Dr. Fuller himself did the operation. you see, somebody had claimed that this set was probably installed, that is the set of insides, was probably installed by Tibetan monks, since there are some papers with Tibetan script, namely these ones right over here. Now I've had a chance to examine them. Geneva and I are literally just embarking on this next project. Honestly, you never know what you might find. This monk statue was rediscovered in a Hungarian museum in 2018, and about 2 years ago now, in March. The sculpture was taken to the Netherlands in order for it to have a CT scan. His seat cushion had an inscription giving many details of who exactly it shows. So you can see the inscription. This is the seat, and you can see the sculpture entering the CT machine. It turned out that it wasn't a carving at all. It was actually a mummified statue. It was an actual person. And carbon-14 measurements show that it dates to between the 11th or 12th century. That is, the monk presumably died somewhere between 1022 to 1133. I now want to turn our conversation to one last point that I want to make about Luohans. The legendary protagonists that I've mentioned today each had their own traditions, which included all sorts of temples, liturgies, and religious communities. So it's possible to imagine to recreate a possible context for our monk by comparison to wood and ceramic sculptures that actually survive inside of Chinese temples. These Luohans are one of the earliest surviving set, that is, they survive in situ. It's a series of painted clay sculptures. Can you imagine to be surrounded by these life-size sculptures with this level of naturalism? It must be quite startling. Now, earlier we saw a small painting showing Guan Yin presiding over 16 Luohans with the dragon tamer at the center of attention. Well, this is actually a 3D version inside a pavilion dedicated to Guan Yin, who is surrounded on each side by 2 rows of 8 Luohans, making 16. And they are dated to the 12th century, the Song dynasty of China. This tradition continued with increasing verisimilitude. That is, it looked much more lifelike, with more details added later. This is a set from the Ming dynasty. And you will notice this set of 16, it even here has a sculpture of a tiger. You remember the pet. Although the matching dragon on the other side here has disappeared, and probably because the original pillar around which a dragon can wind, the pillar was probably destroyed. These Luohans have many wonderful details and gestures, and you will remember I was talking about the 2 types of physiognomies, the fierce or strange or grotesque looking foreigner type, and the quiet, contemplative, inward-looking Chinese monk type. This set has not only young monks or young Luohans, but they also have old Luohans, so age is depicted in these Luohans. There are meditating Luohans, such as here, and shouting Luohans with their pets, such as here. And finally, there is a heavy-browed, intense-eyed, twisting-bodied dragon tamer. He is here holding his pearl. So here ends this afternoon's story about our sculpture, once called The Monk on the Moment of Enlightenment, which we hereby rename the Dragon Tamer. Of course, some mysteries unravel, but in fact, I would say many more remain. There is one final postscript that I'd like you to keep in mind. A monk has been interpreted as being on the cusp of enlightenment for many decades. So you might ask, why did this identification remain so firmly attached? Well, let me suggest a combination of two possible factors. The first is that the identification possibly reflects certain romantic Western notions of Eastern religions, religious art that were commonplace in the early 20th century. The second factor relates perhaps to how Chinese art was shown within the Western context at the time, that is, within the viewer's own most familiar visual sources, than these sources being more likely drawn from Western traditions, such as ones which recall dramatic Christian moments of transition. For example, this one, the conversion of Saul or St. Paul. When you put these two factors together, the words once used in the label to describe our dragon tamer, as I'm showing you here, may as well describe works that show the conversion of Saul. So thank you for listening. And Geneva and I hope that you enjoyed the summary of our research and thinking. Thank you. Goodbye. Nice to see you on Zoom, Geneva.